We're out of time.
The garage smelled like sawdust and broken dreams. Robert stood in the middle of it, looking at the faces staring back at him. His brother, his wife, 3 close friends from work, even his neighbor who'd known him for 15 years. They'd all come because they were worried, really worried. He knew what this looked like. A 42-year-old man throwing away everything he'd worked for. A good job, steady income, benefits, security, all of it gone just like that. And for what? An idea that lived mostly in his head and in dozens of messy sketches scattered across his workbench. You need to think about this realistically, his brother Tom said. He had that tone in his voice, the one that said he was trying to be patient but was running out of it fast. You've got responsibilities. The mortgage doesn't pay itself. Robert nodded slowly. He'd heard all this before, from himself, actually. Late at night, when he couldn't sleep, when the doubt crept in and wrapped around his throat like cold hands. 2 kids in college, his friend David added. Jenny's tuition is due in 2 months. Have you thought about that? Of course he'd thought about it. He'd thought about nothing else for weeks. But every time he tried to convince himself to forget the whole thing, to go crawling back to his old boss and beg for his job back, something stopped him. A memory. His younger sister Lisa, sitting at their parents' piano when they were kids. Her fingers flying across the keys like magic, making music that could make you laugh or cry or feel things you didn't even have names for. And the stroke, 3 years ago. She was only 38, too young for something like that to happen. But it did. And when she woke up in that hospital bed, her left hand wouldn't move right anymore. The doctor said she was lucky. Could have been so much worse. She could walk. She could talk. She could live a normal life. But she couldn't play piano anymore. Not the way she used to. Robert had watched her try once, about 6 months after the stroke. She'd sat down at her keyboard at home, and she'd placed her hands on the keys the way she'd done 10,000 times before. Her right hand remembered everything, but her left hand just sat there, clumsy and useless. The music that came out was broken, wrong. She'd cried, he'd cried, and something had cracked open inside his chest that day. I know it sounds crazy, Robert said now to this room full of people who loved him enough to stage what was basically an intervention. But I have to try to build this thing. This instrument. An instrument that doesn't exist, Tom said flatly. That nobody's asking for. That you have no idea how to actually make. He's right, Robert. That was his wife, speaking for the first time. She stood near the door, arms crossed. Her face was carefully neutral, which somehow felt worse than if she'd been angry. You're an engineer. You build bridges and water systems. You've never built anything like this. I can learn, he said. With what money? Tom shot back. While you're learning, how are you paying the bills? The garage went quiet. Outside, someone's dog was barking. A car drove past. Normal sounds from a normal day in a normal neighborhood where people had normal jobs and didn't quit them to chase impossible ideas. We have some savings, Robert said quietly. His wife's expression changed then. Just a little, a tightness around her eyes. We had savings, past tense, for emergencies, for retirement, for the kids. I know. Do you? Her voice got sharper. Because it feels like you've forgotten about everyone except yourself. This isn't just your life, Robert. We're all connected to your choices. That hit hard because it was true. He wasn't some single guy who could afford to fail. He had people depending on him. People who trusted him to be the steady one. The reliable one. Show them what you're trying to build, his friend Peter said. He'd been quiet until now. At least let them see it. Robert hesitated and walked to his workbench. He picked up his latest sketch and a cardboard prototype he'd been working on. It looked pathetic, honestly, like something a kid might make for a school project. Rubber bands for strings, keys cut out of foam board. But in his head, he could see what it was supposed to be. A hybrid instrument. Part piano, part traditional Chinese guzheng, but modified, adapted, designed specifically for people who couldn't use both hands normally. This is it? Tom asked, not even trying to hide his disbelief. It's just a model, Robert said. A proof of concept. The real thing would be made from wood, proper strings, real keys. It would be beautiful. But what's the point? David asked. I mean, I get that it's personal because of Lisa. That's rough. Man, really. But you can't build a business on one person's problem. It's not just one person, Robert said, his voice getting stronger. Do you know how many people lose mobility in their hands? Strokes, arthritis, injuries, birth conditions. Millions of people. And most of them loved music before. Or wanted to learn, but were told they couldn't because traditional instruments don't work for them. So let someone else build it, Tom said. Some company that actually knows what they're doing. Nobody else is building it. Robert's voice rose. He took a breath, forced himself to calm down. I've looked. I've researched. There are adaptive instruments, sure, but nothing like this. Nothing that lets someone with limited hand mobility actually make real music. Not simplified music, not therapy exercises. Real music. The silence that followed felt heavy. His wife spoke again, and her voice was tired. What happens when the money runs out? When you've been at this for 6 months, and you've got nothing to show for it except a garage full of broken prototypes? Then I'll get another job. Will you? She uncrossed her arms, and he could see how exhausted she was. Exhausted from worrying, from doing the mental math on their finances, from lying awake wondering if her husband had lost his mind. Or will you keep saying just one more month? Just one more try? Because I know you, Robert. When you get obsessed with something, you can't let it go. She was right about that, too. He'd always been that way. As a kid, he'd taken apart the family radio to figure out how it worked. Spent 2 weeks on it. His dad had been furious. But Robert had gotten it back together eventually. That's who he was. Someone who needed to understand things. To solve problems. To build solutions with his own hands. I'm not asking you to believe in this, he said, looking at each person in turn. I know it looks crazy from the outside, but I'm asking you to give me a chance. To let me try. Tom shook his head and headed for the door. David followed. Peter paused, put a hand on Robert's shoulder for a moment, then left too. His wife was the last one standing there. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said very quietly, I hope you know what you're doing, because if this doesn't work, we lose everything. Then she walked out too. Robert stood alone in his garage, surrounded by tools he barely knew how to use and dreams that everyone thought were foolish. His hands were shaking. From fear, maybe, or adrenaline, or the terrifying freedom of having finally committed to something that might destroy his life. He picked up a piece of wood from his workbench, ran his thumb along its grain. These hands had built a lot of things over the years. Important things. Bridges that carried thousands of people every day. Systems that brought clean water to entire communities. But they'd never built anything that touched the soul. Maybe it was time they did, even if everyone said to stop. The first month was the hardest. Not because of the work itself, but because Robert had no idea what he was doing. He'd been an engineer his whole adult life, sure. But engineering bridges and engineering musical instruments were completely different things. It was like being a chef and thinking that meant you could perform surgery. Same general category, totally different skills. He started with YouTube. Hours and hours of videos about woodworking. How to choose the right type of wood, how to cut it without the grain splitting, how to sand it smooth. He watched a guy in Finland make a violin from scratch. took the guy 8 months. Robert had hoped he'd be done in 3. Hope was a funny thing. It could carry you pretty far, but it couldn't teach your hands what they didn't know. His first attempt at building the frame fell apart the second day. The joints weren't strong enough. He'd used the wrong kind of glue. The wood he'd chosen was too soft. It warped overnight in his garage, bending like it was trying to escape from his incompetence. He started over. The second attempt made it a week before one of the support beams cracked right down the middle. He'd been so careful that time, measured everything twice, used better wood. But he'd miscalculated the tension from the strings. When he'd tightened them to test the sound, the whole thing just snapped. The crack was so loud, his wife came running from inside the house, thinking something had exploded. She'd stood in the doorway, looking at the broken pieces on his workbench, and hadn't said anything. Didn't need to. Her expression said it all. By the 3rd month, Robert had gone through most of their emergency fund. The wood alone cost more than he'd expected. Good wood, the kind that could actually carry sound properly, wasn't cheap. Then there were the tools he needed to buy. The strings he had to special order. The books on acoustic engineering that cost $60 each. His son called one Sunday. They talked about classes, about his roommate, about everything except what Robert was doing with his life. Then, right before hanging up, his son said, "Hey, Dad, my friend asked what you do for work." I didn't really know what to say. The silence on the line hurt, worse than any words could have. "Just tell them I'm working on a project," Robert said. "Yeah, okay, sure." After they hung up, Robert sat in his garage and stared at his hands. These stupid, clumsy hands that couldn't seem to build what his brain could see so clearly. In his mind, the instrument was perfect. Beautiful curves, rich sound, keys that responded to the lightest touch. But in reality, everything he made looked like junk. His daughter came home for spring break in April. She was his youngest, his baby, even though she was 19 now. She'd always been close to him. Used to spend hours in the garage when she was little, handing him tools, asking a million questions. This time she barely came out to see him. She stayed inside, watching TV with her mom, going out with her old high school friends. On her 3rd day home, he asked if she wanted to see what he was working on. "Maybe later, Dad," she said, not looking up from her phone. Later never came. The night before she went back to school, he found her in the kitchen getting a snack. "You're mad at me," he said. She closed the refrigerator harder than necessary. "I'm not mad. You won't even look at what I'm building, because I don't want to see it, okay?" Her voice cracked a little. "I don't want to see you fail. It's too hard to watch." She left the next morning. He hugged her goodbye, and she hugged him back, but it felt different, distant, like she was already protecting herself from the disappointment she knew was coming. By May, Robert had built and destroyed 7 prototypes. 7 failures. Each one taught him something, sure. But each one also cost money they didn't have, and time he was running out of. The lowest point came on a Tuesday night. He'd spent 3 weeks on prototype number 8. This one he'd been so sure about. He'd figured out the weight distribution, fixed the joint problem, used a different configuration for the strings that should have produced a cleaner sound. He'd invited a musician to come test it, a guy named Phil who played at the community center sometimes. Phil had been nice about coming over, probably out of pity more than anything. Robert had been so nervous setting it up. His hands were actually shaking as he adjusted the height, made sure everything was in tune. Phil sat down in front of it, looked it over, cracked his knuckles. Then he played. The sound that came out was awful, not just bad, truly, genuinely terrible. Like a cat fighting with an accordion inside a garbage disposal. Phil stopped after about 10 seconds. He tried a few different key combinations, pulled at the strings gently, then harder. Everything he did just produced more horrible noise. "It's Phil said, clearly trying to be kind. "It's an interesting concept. After Phil left, Robert sat on his garage floor. It was almost 2 in the morning. The concrete was cold under him. Sawdust covered everything, including his clothes and hair. He'd failed again. And this time, he'd been so certain it would work. He cried. Proper, shoulder-shaking, can't-catch-your-breath crying. The kind he hadn't done since he was a kid. All the pressure of the last few months came pouring out. The money, the disappointment in everyone's eyes, the slow, creeping realization that maybe everyone had been right. Maybe he should have just stopped when they told him to. The garage door opened. His wife stood there in her bathrobe. She looked at him on the floor, surrounded by his broken dreams and wood shavings, and for a moment he thought she was going to yell, tell him this was it, that they were done, that he'd had his chance and blown it. Instead, she walked over and sat down next to him, right there on the cold garage floor. She didn't say anything at first, just picked up one of his sketches and studied it in the dim light. Do you remember our wedding? She finally asked. He nodded, confused about where this was going. You made a speech at the reception. You were a little drunk. She smiled slightly at the memory. You promised me a life of adventure. You said you'd never let us get boring, that we'd always keep trying new things, taking risks, really living. I remember, he said quietly. I didn't know it would look like this. She gestured at the disaster around them. Honestly, this is harder than I thought, scarier. But Robert? She looked at him directly. I'm still here. I didn't marry you because you were safe. I married you because you gave a damn about things. Because when you saw something that needed fixing, you couldn't walk away. He felt tears coming again, but different this time. That said, she continued, her voice getting more serious, we need to be realistic. I went through our accounts today, really looked at the numbers. She pulled out her phone, showed him a spreadsheet she'd made. We have 4 months. Maybe 5 if we're really careful. That's it. After that, we'll have to sell the house. 4 months. He'd been at this for 6 months already, and he still didn't have anything that worked. 4 more months to build something he hadn't been able to build in half a year. The math wasn't encouraging. So what do I do? He asked. She stood up, brushed the sawdust off her robe. You have 120 days to make this work. No more. If you can't do it by then, you get a job. Any job, and this dream goes in a box in the attic with all the other might-have-beens. She headed toward the door, then stopped. But until then, you better work like you've never worked before. Because I didn't sit on this freezing floor at 2 in the morning to watch you give up. After she left, Robert sat there a while longer. 4 months, 120 days. It sounded like a lot, and like nothing at all. He looked at his hands again, calloused now from all the work, scarred in a few places from careless mistakes with sharp tools. They'd failed so many times already, but they had 120 more days to figure it out. He stood up, looked at the broken prototype on his workbench, and instead of seeing another failure, he tried to see what it was teaching him, what he'd learned, what he could do different next time. The garage was quiet except for the hum of his space heater. Outside, the whole neighborhood was asleep, normal people in their normal beds, not worrying about impossible dreams. Robert picked up his pencil and a fresh sheet of paper. A 1 of 120 time to get back to work. Desperation did something interesting to Robert. It stripped away all the fancy ideas he'd been clinging to, all the complicated features he thought the instrument needed, all the ways he'd been trying to reinvent everything from scratch. When you only have 120 days, you can't afford to waste time on things that don't matter. He started visiting places he'd been avoiding. The first was a rehabilitation center about 20 minutes from his house. He called ahead, explained what he was trying to do, and asked if he could observe some therapy sessions. The director was skeptical at first, but something in Robert's voice must have convinced her. She said yes. The first day there changed everything. He watched a woman in her 60s trying to relearn how to button her shirt. Something so simple. Something most people did without thinking. But her right hand had been damaged in a car accident, and now every button was a battle. She was crying with frustration, but she kept trying, over and over. He watched a young guy, maybe 25, working with blocks, just picking them up and putting them down. The therapist explained he'd been a guitarist before a workplace injury crushed 3 fingers on his left hand. He'd never play guitar again. The look in that guy's eyes, the emptiness there, it reminded Robert of his sister. After the session, Robert talked to the occupational therapist. Her name was Dr. Chun, and she'd been doing this for 15 years. What do people miss most? He asked her, when they lose hand function, what's the thing they wish they could still do? She thought about it. The specific things vary, but it's almost always something creative. Playing music, painting, knitting, writing by hand. Things that made them feel like themselves. So if you could give them back one thing, just one, what would it be? The ability to express themselves, she said without hesitation. To create something beautiful again. That's what breaks people's spirits more than anything else. Robert started going to that rehab center 3 times a week. He'd sit in the corner with his notebook, just watching, studying how people adapted, how they used their good hand to compensate, what movements were easy for them, and what was impossible. He also started talking to musicians, not fancy concert pianists, but regular people who played for fun, people who taught lessons, people who played at churches and community centers. He asked them all the same questions. What makes an instrument easy to play? What makes it hard? If you could only use one hand, what would you need? One guitarist told him something that stuck. It's not about the notes you can play. It's about whether you can make those notes mean something. You can play 3 notes and make someone cry if they're the right 3 notes. Simple. But somehow Robert had forgotten that. He'd been so focused on making his instrument do everything that he'd lost sight of what it actually needed to do. It needed to let someone make music that mattered. That was it. He went back to his garage with fresh eyes, looked at all his failed prototypes, all the complicated mechanisms he'd built, all the extra features he thought were necessary. Then he started taking things away. He simplified the key design, made them wider, easier to hit, added subtle ridges so someone could feel where each key was without looking, removed the keys that didn't add much to the sound. He went from 48 keys down to 24, then down to 18. The strings were next. He'd been trying to use traditional spacing, but that required too much precision, so he spread them out, made them easier to reach, used materials that would sing even with a light touch. You wouldn't need strength to make sound anymore. Just intention. The frame got lighter, easier to position. He added adjustable feet so it could work for someone sitting or standing. Could be tilted for someone in a wheelchair. Every decision he made now had a purpose. Nothing extra. Nothing fancy. Just what was needed. It was almost midnight on a Thursday when something shifted. He was working on the string tension, trying to find that sweet spot between too loose and too tight. He plucked one string, then another, adjusting by feel more than calculation. And then he heard it. A note that didn't sound broken. That didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like music. His hands froze. He plucked it again. Same clear, clean tone. He tried the next string, then the next. Each one rang out pure and true. He sat back, barely breathing. Then he placed his right hand on the keys, his left hand on the strings, and played a simple melody. Just a children's song. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. It worked. It actually worked. He played it again, and this time his eyes filled with tears. It wasn't perfect, wasn't concert hall quality, but it was real. It was music. Music that someone with one good hand could make. He looked at the clock. 2 months left on his deadline. But for the first time in forever, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could actually pull this off. The next day, he called his sister Lisa. They'd talked a few times over the past months, but he'd been vague about his progress. Didn't want to get her hopes up when he kept failing. But now he had something real to show her. "Can you come over tomorrow?" he asked. "Is everything okay?" She sounded worried. "Yeah, I just need you to test something for me." She arrived on Saturday afternoon. She looked nervous walking into the garage. She'd seen his failed attempts before, heard the terrible sounds they made. He could tell she was bracing herself for another disappointment. The instrument sat on his workbench, covered with a sheet. He'd spent the last 2 days making small adjustments, polishing it, making it look as good as it sounded. He'd even carved a small design into the wood. A bridge, because that's what this was. A bridge between ability and expression. "Okay," he said. "Before you look at it, I need you to know something. This isn't like the piano you used to play. It's different. But I think, if you give it a chance, you might be able to make music again." Lisa's hand went to her mouth. "Robert, don't. Don't get my hopes up if this is just another." "It's not," he said, quietly. "This one's different. I promise." He pulled off the sheet. The instrument was beautiful. Simple, but beautiful. The wood was smooth and warm-colored. The keys were slightly larger than normal, with tiny grooves marking each octave. The strings caught the light like silver threads. Lisa stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "What do I do?" He showed her. How to position herself. How her right hand could handle both the keys and some of the strings if she moved her wrist a certain way. How the instrument was designed to sound complete, even with just one hand playing. She placed her right hand on the keys, hesitant, afraid maybe of what would happen, of being disappointed again. She pressed down on one key. A single note rang out, clear and true. Her breath caught. She tried another key, then another. Then she brushed her fingers across the strings, and they sang. "Oh my God," she whispered. She started to play. Slowly at first, finding her way. The melody was shaky, uncertain. But it was there. Real music was coming from her hand, and Robert could see the exact moment she realized it was really happening. Her eyes filled with tears, but she kept playing. The melody got stronger, more confident. She was smiling and crying at the same time, and Robert was doing the same thing, standing there watching his little sister make music for the first time in 3 years. She played for 20 minutes straight. Simple melodies at first, then trying more complex things, getting braver. Sometimes she'd hit a wrong note and laugh. Sometimes she'd find a combination that sounded beautiful and gasp. But she never stopped, couldn't stop. 3 years of silence was pouring out of her through this instrument, and it was the most beautiful thing Robert had ever heard. When she finally stopped, her hand was shaking from effort. She looked up at him with this expression, like she couldn't find words big enough for what she was feeling. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it." Robert pulled out his phone. "Can I record you playing, just for a few minutes?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "What song?" "Whatever you want." She thought for a moment, then started playing a melody Robert recognized. One of their mom's favorite songs from when they were kids. She played it slower than the original, adapted it for one hand, but somehow that made it more beautiful, more personal. Robert recorded the whole thing. 3 minutes of his sister making music again, creating something beautiful with her one good hand and this instrument that everyone had told him not to try to build. That night, after Lisa left, Robert sat in his garage holding his phone. He watched the video again, listened to the music, saw the joy on his sister's face. Then, almost without thinking, he opened his social media. He'd barely used it in months. Too busy. Too embarrassed to show people what he was doing. But now he had something worth sharing. He uploaded the video with a simple caption, "For everyone who was told they couldn't." Then he put his phone down and went to bed. He had no idea what was about to happen. Robert woke up to his phone buzzing, not just once or twice, but constantly, like it was having a seizure on his nightstand. He grabbed it, squinting at the screen in the early morning light. Notifications, hundreds of them. His social media app had basically exploded overnight. The video of Lisa playing had 40,000 views, and it was still climbing. He sat up in bed, fully awake now. His wife rolled over, mumbling something about turning off the noise. He scrolled through the comments, his heart pounding. "This made me cry. My dad had a stroke last year and hasn't touched his guitar since. Where can I buy this? My daughter has cerebral palsy, and she's always wanted to play music. I'm a music teacher, and I have 3 students. Who could use something like this?" The comments kept going, hundreds of them. People tagging friends, sharing the video, telling their own stories about loved ones who'd lost the ability to make music. By the time he got out of bed, the video had hit 100,000 views. By lunch, it was at 500,000. By dinner, it crossed 1 million. His phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days straight. The first call that really mattered came from a woman named Dr. Patricia Hayes. She was the director of a disability advocacy organization that worked with musicians. She'd seen the video, and she wanted to talk. "What you've built," she said, her voice warm but professional. "It's exactly what we've been telling instrument manufacturers we need for years. But nobody's listened." "I'm listening," Robert said. They talked for 2 hours. She explained the scope of the need: millions of people with limited hand mobility. Kids born with conditions that made traditional instruments impossible. Veterans who'd lost fingers or hands. Elderly people with arthritis. The list went on and on. "If you're serious about this," she said, "we'd like to help. We have connections to music therapy programs, schools, rehabilitation centers. We can get your instrument into the hands of people who need it." "I'm serious," Robert told his wife, looking at the single lonely prototype on his garage workbench. "But I'm going to need help. I can't make these by myself." She smiled, her support a lifeline. "Leave that to us," she said. That was the beginning. First, his son's video of the instrument went viral. Then came a call from a museum. A real museum. They wanted to feature his instrument in an exhibit on accessible innovation. They were going to pay him. Pay him to display something he built in his garage. Then came the manufacturer, a company specializing in adaptive technology. They'd seen the video, done their research, and they wanted to license his design. They wanted to produce the instruments at scale, to bring them to music therapy programs across the entire country. The number they offered made Robert's hands shake. It was enough to pay off everything he'd spent. Enough for his kids' college tuition. Enough to rebuild their savings and more. That night, he sat in his garage, staring at the contract on his laptop screen. Just 3 months ago, he was on this same concrete floor, crying, thinking he had destroyed his family's future. Now, he was looking at more money than he'd made in 2 years at his old engineering job. His wife walked in, her face etched with concern. What happened? He just turned the screen towards her. He watched her eyes go wide as she read the number. And then she started crying. But this time, they were happy tears. The kind that come from a relief so intense it has to escape. She hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." But the moment that truly changed everything came about 6 months later. Robert was invited to speak at a rehabilitation center in Seattle. They had purchased 10 of his instruments, now officially named the Harmony Bridge, for their music therapy program. He was nervous the whole flight. He was a builder, not a public speaker. But when he walked into the therapy room and saw those instruments lined up, each one being played by someone who thought they'd never make music again, something settled in his chest. a feeling of rightness he'd never experienced before. After his talk, where he stumbled through his speech about perseverance, people came up to thank him. One elderly man grabbed his hand. "I was a piano player for 40 years, he said, his voice shaking. Then arthritis took it all away. I thought I was done. But with your instrument, I can play again. You gave me back a piece of my soul." Robert just nodded, trying not to cry. Then he saw her. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, being wheeled toward him by her mother. Her right arm ended just below the elbow. She looked up at him with huge, cautious brown eyes. "Are you the man who made the music thing?" she asked softly. Robert knelt down to her level. "Yeah, that's me. My mom says people like me can play it. Is that true?" The way she said, "people like me," broke something inside him. Like she had already learned to put herself in a separate, limited category. "It's absolutely true," Robert said. "Would you like to try?" Her face lit up. "Really?" He glanced at her mother, who nodded, already wiping away tears. They went over to a harmony bridge. Robert adjusted it for her. "Okay," he said gently. "Put your hand right here. See these little grooves? They help you find the keys. Now just press down. Gentle, like you're petting a cat." She placed her small hand on the keys, pressed one. A clear, beautiful note rang out. She gasped, looking at the instrument like it was pure magic. "I did that? You did that? Can I do it again?" "You can do it as many times as you want." For the next 20 minutes, Robert sat with her, showing her simple melodies. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Mary had a little lamb. To her, it was a symphony. She was making music. Real music, with her one hand. Her mother stood behind them, openly sobbing. The rest of the room had gone quiet, watching this little girl completely absorbed, discovering the sounds she could create. When it was time to leave, she hugged Robert's legs, as high as she could reach from her wheelchair. "Thank you for making this," she said. "I never got to make music before." After they left, Robert just stood there, processing what had just happened. He'd built something with his hands that had given that little girl a voice, a way to create, a way to feel like she belonged. On the flight home, he couldn't stop thinking about her face, that expression of pure joy and discovery. He thought about all the people who told him to stop, all the times he wanted to quit, all those nights surrounded by failure in his garage. If he had listened, that little girl would still believe that music was something for other people, not for people like her. His phone buzzed. A text from his son. "Hey, Dad, just saw the article about you in the tech magazine. Sent it to all my friends. Really proud of you." Then his daughter. "Dad, my roommate's grandmother has arthritis really bad. Can she get one of your instruments? This is so cool what you're doing." And his brother Tom. "Okay, I was wrong. Completely wrong. You did something amazing. Sorry I ever doubted you." Robert smiled, looking out the airplane window at the clouds. His wife was waiting for him at home. His garage was no longer a monument to failure, but a workshop where the impossible became real. But none of the contracts, the articles, or the praise mattered as much as that little girl's face. That moment she realized she could make music. He looked down at his own hands' regular, scarred, calloused hands. They had built good, important things before, but they had never touched a soul until they built something everyone said was impossible. He pulled out a small notebook, and on a blank page he wrote, "For everyone who was told they couldn't, keep going, keep building, keep trying. Your hands might create something unforgettable." Below the plane, somewhere, people were playing his instrument, making music, discovering their own capabilities. All because one man in a garage refused to give up. He believed his hands could build something that mattered. And they did. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire.